organization at the Opera House in San Francisco. We are momentarily awaiting the entrance of the president for the conference today. We understand at this point that Secretary of State Edward R. Stettinius Jr. is going to take his place with the American delegation down on the main floor. Obviously, that being the case, he will not be the presiding officer. We have had no word as to who it will be up until this moment. The Klieg lights were turned on about 45 minutes ago here. The session was to get underway at 10:30 this morning. It is now about 5 minutes after 11. So we've been waiting momentarily here for the conference to officially begin. There's been a great deal of activity down in the delegate section of the House this morning. We haven't yet been able to determine exactly what has caused it. There has been some rumor of activity in Europe. Perhaps that has inspired it. And now I see Mr. T.V. Soong is the first to come on to the speaker's rostrum, stands in front of the microphones, and now we'll turn you down to the speaker's rostrum for the gavel opening the session.
Fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the third plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization is called to order. At this session of the conference, we shall have the honor of hearing further statements from the chairman of the delegations. I shall recognize in alphabetical order those who have indicated a desire to speak to the conference at this time. First, I recognize His Excellency, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Delegation of Czechoslovakia.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency Jan Masaryk, just approaching the rostrum, shaking hands now with the presiding chairman, Mr. Soong, places on his glasses, now taking a drink of water, placing it back onto the speaker's stand.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the preceding distinguished speakers paid eloquent tribute to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. May I join them in saying that the suffering people all over the world, people in distress, people bewildered by the succession of horrors of this cataclysm, have lost a tower of strength to draw courage from, a dear, understanding, helping friend. I have come to beautiful San Francisco on my way to Prague, the lovely capital of Czechoslovakia. I came from London by way of Moscow, where I had the privilege of seeing the unique effort of the magnificent people of the Soviet Union, led by that great Marshal Stalin. Yesterday, the papers brought news to the Czechoslovak delegation, which some of you may have overlooked. Brno, the capital of our province of Moravia, has been liberated by the Red Army. Our joy is more than equaled by our everlasting gratitude to our Slav brothers. Yesterday we also heard that the American and British forces have met their Soviet allies on German territory in order to squeeze the remaining life out of Hitler's Volga Valhalla once and for all. Very good news indeed, welcomed by all who have suffered at the hands of the Hun. One of the good qualities of Czechoslovaks is that they know how to be grateful. We are deeply grateful indeed to the liberating Red Army, to Great Britain for giving us asylum and hospitality during the blackest days of our history, to the United States for their generous help and understanding. One of the last telegrams President Roosevelt sent before he left us was to my chief, President Beneš, congratulating him on my government's return to our liberated territory. He was like that. After Dunkirk, Great Britain, and I was there at the time, stood alone, and at that moment, the voice of Winston Churchill was the voice of all decent people on earth. Some people say it was a miracle. I am not too good at believing in miracles, but I did not believe that Great Britain would be overwhelmed, and I said so at the time. Then came the epic of Stalingrad. From Stalingrad, the Red Army has marched to Berlin because, as Mr. Eden said, there was a job to be done. And what a job they did. And then the invasions of Africa and the continent of Europe. Miracles? Perhaps, but very well prepared miracles. I represent a small country in size, placed in the heart of Europe. My country has signed a treaty with the Soviet Union a year and a half ago. We intend to cooperate with our great Eastern ally loyally and wholeheartedly, at the same time keeping up our long and fruitful relations with the Western democracies. I was in London while the courageous inhabitants of that great metropolis, women and children, faced a continuous attack almost as deadly as that on the battlefronts. Indeed, London was a battlefront. To have lived with the London folk during these continuous trials and dangers is a privilege I honor and cherish more than I can say. They were magnificent. I have seen heroes from the underground of Warsaw, Belgrade, Brussels, Athens, Paris, and Prague, and in their presence I felt very humble indeed. If I judge the spirit of this conference correctly, I am addressing the representatives of the people who have fought the good fight to win this war. Who are they? They are the countless heroes of the United Nations, the Red Army, the GIs, the British Tommies. They are the Chinese warriors. They are the Russian, Polish, Yugoslav, French, and Czechoslovak guerrillas. And last but not least, the suffering inhabitants of the terrible concentration camps and ghettos. My country, fellow delegates, has been one concentration camp since 1939. To make the world worthy of all their sacrifices and sufferings, to keep faith with our dead, this conference has been convened. We, who have survived in comparative safety, have an almost crushing responsibility. Ours is a collective job of the first magnitude. We shall either create an effective organization to guarantee a permanent peace, even by force if necessary, or we shall descend to the depth of iniquity, which I once called a mechanized Stone Age. In San Francisco, there are at this moment assembled delegates of 46 nations, who for the last 25 years have been affected profoundly by the lack of an international instrument with a punch behind it. The idea of the League of Nations was a very lofty one, but the punch was conspicuous by its absence. That cannot be repeated. By now, all of us have had the opportunity to study the Dumbarton Oaks draft from all the various aspects. Undoubtedly, there are points in it which it may be our worthwhile to re-examine jointly when the time comes. For my own part, questions such as the revitalization of international law and of the observance of treaty obligations, respect for the territorial integrity, the definition of aggression, and eventually the implementation of the Economic and Social Council will prove worthy of our friendly consideration. The Dumbarton Oaks draft is a vast improvement upon the past. We have been invited to San Francisco by the four powers in whose keeping the responsibility for future peace is concentrated. I put the cause of Czechoslovakia and the promise of her full cooperation into their hands, flanked as they are by the unanimous will for peace of all the United Nations, who have the privilege of sharing this responsibility in a major or minor way. They can and must lead us toward a better tomorrow after an unspeakably frightful yesterday. I pray, I trust, I know we shall succeed, we must succeed.
That, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the short but very eloquent speech by His Excellency Jan Masaryk, Minister for Foreign Affairs from Czechoslovakia. Mr. Sung arises, back to the rostrum.
I shall now recognize His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Delegation of Egypt.
Ladies and gentlemen, now approaching the Speaker's rostrum is Abdel Hamid Badawi Pasha, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He shakes hands with Mr. Sung, puts his paper on the rostrum, and is about to speak.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Egyptian delegation, may I, on this memorable occasion, pay a deep-felt tribute to the memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the great leader who, after having brought the world to the threshold of a new era of peace and world security, paved the way for this conference. His disappearance from the international scene is most certainly a great loss, and our highest homage to his memory will be to make this conference a success, to build a foundation for lasting world peace. This success can only be brought about by mutual confidence, tolerance, and negotiation. Egypt is proud of the valuable contribution it has been able to give to the victory of the United Nations in the highly strategic Mediterranean area. In addition to the protection of the Suez Canal and other parts of the country, so vital to the movement of allied troops and supplies, she has given continuously, since the outbreak of the present conflict, her full support by all means within her power, all of which has been widely commended by the Allied High Command, both on land and sea. Egypt comes here with a background of law-abiding democratic tradition, intent on cooperation to the fullest degree, and hopeful that through the framework of the Charter to be set up may be brought together all the discordant interests and divergent tendencies of all nations, so that through lawful means and orderly procedure will come ultimate relief from the devastating scourge of war. None of us surely need to be reminded that after the pains and sufferings of the last war, great hopes were raised and high promises freely dispensed to the people of a bleeding world. Lofty phrases promised a new order and a better humanity, but soon the hardships and sufferings were forgotten. Forgotten also were the promises and shattered the hopes. This time we owe it to our men, to our women, to our children, following that drastic lesson in which none was spared the horror and atrocity of war, that what we build here and now should be so well conceived and so thoroughly planned that the promises and pledges that bring us here may find their full realization. We of Egypt, conscious of our obligations and sincerely eager to place our shoulders to the wheel, feel it is our duty to state our point of view to the other members of the family of nations, in the belief that by such a frank exchange of views, we may help to attain the precious objectives to which we dedicate ourselves. First and foremost, it is our belief that the keystone of this arch of peace, which we seek here to build, should be the deep-rooted principles enunciated in the Atlantic Charter. That day in the Atlantic, in mid-August of 1941, when the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the President of the United States met and wrote down certain fundamental thoughts, they wrote a charter for all humanity. These fundamentals stirred every human heart. These fundamentals reached across the 7 seas and brought hope to millions that the savage struggles of war were not to be in vain. In these fundamental principles are compressed the hopes and aspirations of a troubled world. It is upon their fulfillment that the United Nations pledged themselves in their joint declaration of January 1st, 1942, and it is on the basis of that declaration that the present gathering takes place. How can we meet in this solemn conclave and overlook the message that these principles imply? In fact, the Atlantic Charter was not only a blessing for humanity in its direct promises and prospects, it was equally so in its implications and in its indirect commitments. In the message in which the late President Roosevelt made it known to the Congress, he heralded to the world the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Beside the first 2, for which the world has fought in past ages, and which may be considered as the richest worldwide achievements of constitutional progress, he gave to humanity the other 2 as most vital to the new conditions and trends of modern life. The Dumbarton Oaks proposals are mainly concerned with organizing the conditions of freedom from fear and the necessary establishment of agencies whose principal aim is to maintain peace and security by settling conflicts and enforcing justice in the international field. In other words, what I would term the negative side of the international problem. The positive side, in my judgment, consists in the development of international solidarity and cooperation, which, however, I feel has not been neglected. Certainly, we must grant to the authors of these Dumbarton Oaks proposals the glory that is theirs. The lessons of the war have not been lost upon them. The world has learned by painful experience that economic unrest and social troubles always are at the bottom of international disorders, and that the best way to prevent war and maintain peace is to provide the world with a working system of cooperation. It would be unjust not to recognize the achievement of the League of Nations in that field, but it would be equally unfair not to realize the broader vision which the Dumbarton Oaks proposals show by comparison to the work of the League. The economic and social functions of the Assembly, the institution of the Economic and Social Council, are a proof of a new conception of international affairs. It is much less by settling conflicts and adjudicating disputes that peace and order can be maintained and human happiness secured. These ends can be more easily attained by promoting cooperation in cultural understanding, by setting a better pattern for international trade and monetary problems and other economic questions, by assigning to mankind a higher standard of living based on the fact that the best conditions for maintaining a high standard in a country is to secure the highest standard possible in the other countries. We of Egypt hope that that part of Dumbarton Oaks proposals may receive the greatest care and attention, and that the future organization will be planned so as to make it most effective. We plead for the continued earnest thought of all people for the development and clarification of international law. Several other governments have spoken out on this point, and we agree that if a new channel or agency is needed to accomplish it, either through the General Assembly or through the Economic and Social Council, it should be here provided. The obvious weakness of international law was that, contrary to all other branches of law, its rules could not be enforced. Now, with military power being placed at the disposal of a world organization, it is logical that the rules of international law need to be determined, defined, and codified. The rules now generally accepted as the law of nations, which are the outcome of the evolution of centuries of international practice, have often helped to avoid armed conflicts and to develop peaceful relations between different states. Better defined, it would help more. In this connection, and with a view of harmonizing international relationships, we suggest it as a duty of the conference to prescribe principles for the revision of treaties which have become inconsistent with the new concept of world conditions and collective security, and might therefore become irritants and a possible source of conflict. In the tentative proposals of Dumbarton Oaks, a distinction is noted between the great powers or permanent members of the Council and the other powers, the latter being composed of the so-called medium and small powers. If we assume for all practical reasons that a privileged position for the great powers is justified by the larger responsibilities they undertake in the maintenance of peace, we nevertheless believe that a better balance between the great powers and the medium and small states should be achieved, and to accomplish this we submit certain revisions. In fact, the experience of the League of Nations should enable us to avoid many mistakes of the past. These mistakes may have been due to an excessive division of responsibilities, but would it not be equally a mistake to go to the opposite extreme by adopting a scheme of concentrating the whole power in the hands of the very few? Taken as a whole, the group of medium and small powers constitute an important element in the organization of world peace, numbering as they do no less than 40 states scattered all over the globe, which have their own national life and an independence acquired by years and sometimes centuries of toil and struggle. Their adhesion to the new organization implies that in the general interest they should abandon to the Security Council some of their fundamental prerogatives. They may also be called upon to give effect to its decisions by armed force or by according facilities on their territories or by adopting economic measures entailing heavy sacrifices. It would therefore be difficult to justify a scheme under which these states should not be able to voice their views inside the Council, nor participate in framing the policy they will have to follow, though it may sometimes be detrimental to their own interests. The support given to the World Organization by the whole group of smaller powers should entitle them to a large representation in the Council. The number of members should be raised to 14. This would not affect the privileges of the permanent members of the Council. In spite of the increased number of members, the decisions would be carried by a majority of eight votes, which might be qualified or not according to the case under examination. In this manner, the increase in the number of members of the Council would not hinder prompt action by the Security Council, nor would the permanent members lose their influence. On the other hand, if the designation of the non-permanent members of the Council is provided for without some positive criterion being the basis of their election, if it is left to the hazard of the ballot, to temporary combinations, or struggle for influence, then in spite of the broadening of the Council, the representation of the whole group of smaller states may still prove entirely inadequate. The surest and most objective basis would be to secure the permanent representation in the Council of all the principal regions of the world. In an organization which exerts its functions and powers over the whole surface of the globe, the choice of elected members should be based on territorial representation, so that no great region in the world, aside from the territories of the 5 great powers, should be left without an effective share in the work of the Council. The representation of states should be based on regional zones corresponding to electoral constituencies, the General Assembly choosing a representative for each region. The Security Council, reflecting in its major strength the thought of the great powers, should have an opportunity to act on its own initiative without having to consult the Assembly. This function would be comparable to that of an executive to whom full powers have been given by the legislative branch of the government. To override the Council's decision in the proposed world organization, it might be provided that the Assembly could interfere with the Council's action only by a majority as impressive as 3/4. A general system of checks and balances, were incorporated into constitutional government everywhere, have strengthened the framework of those governments. It is axiomatic in government that the strongest reflection of popular will comes from the branch which is most widely representative of the mass of the people. To that end, it is our belief that the Assembly, including every nation in the membership of the organization, will more widely and truly mirror the public opinion of the world. Therefore, acts of the Council submitted to it for review will gain, rather than lose, strength in the process. We believe that a change of the presently contemplated veto propositions of the Dumbarton Oaks draft will serve to inspire greater confidence in the democratic aims of the new world order. Certainly, we trust that the great powers, eager to follow the traditionally democratic procedures of law and government, will see their way clear to a revision of the veto plan as now proposed. Permitting any power, great or small, to sit both as judge and jury in its own case does not, in our opinion, contribute to build worldwide confidence so necessary to the success of a plan for world order. The purpose, as I have said, of these proposals to change the voting methods is to strengthen the primary foundations of the organization and bring to it the greatest possible measure of public esteem and confidence. Without exhausting our observations on the proposals of the Dumbarton Oaks, we saw fit to dwell on these few thoughts with the knowledge that from this community of interests of all states, the large and the small, the powerful and the weak, the old and the young, will come a tested, strengthened, and revitalized vehicle for the maintenance of international peace and security that we all cherish. And gentlemen, in closing, may I remind you that just 2 years ago, several statesmen gathered in my country to discuss the vexatious problems of war and the even more trying problems of the peace to come. These statesmen included the dynamic Churchill, the valiant Chiang Kai-shek, and the gallant leader, the late Franklin Delano Roosevelt, having just completed a conference with the indomitable Stalin. They met one autumn day in a spacious and beautiful garden not far from the great pyramids of Egypt. built 5,000 years ago by the predecessors of our present Egyptian people. You can well picture the scene as the circling sun drew the shadow of the giant pyramid across the garden setting, a shadow that has made its daily appearance month by month, year by year, century by century, for the last 5,000 years. These early Egyptians built for permanence. And in this solemn hour, may I express the hope that we may start here an enterprise for peace to satisfy the yearnings of the people of the world. May we hope that the edifice we build today, will be so true, so fine, and so strong that in the months and years and centuries to come, the sons of another day may permanently, like the shadows of our great pyramid, cast its influence for good permanently upon the people of the earth.
And so we conclude the second speech of the third plenary session here at the Opera House. His Excellency Abdel Hamid Badawi Pasha, Minister of Foreign Affairs from Egypt. Again, Mr. Sung.
I now recognize His Excellency, the Chairman of the Delegation of Honduras and Ambassador of Honduras to the United States.
Now our third speaker is approaching the Speaker's rostrum, Julian R. Cáceres, Ambassador to the United States from Honduras. He slowly makes his way now to the Speaker's rostrum. Mr. T.V. Sung reaches out with his hand, and it is quite a reach. He takes the prepared script from his pocket and is about to speak.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen. In April 1917, the United States of America declared war on imperialist Germany. This war had been provoked by Germany in her violation of the freedom of the seas and her ruthless disregard of international treaties. At that time, the Republic of Honduras, loyal to the principles of freedom, adhered undeviatingly to the cause defended so earnestly by America in the battlefields of Europe. Thus, it was that the Republic of Honduras participated in the Versailles conferences, which resulted in part in the creation of the League of Nations, the first international organization which had as its aim the guarantee of peace to the world. At the inauguration of the League on the 16th of January 1920, a new era for humanity began. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan, which had belonged to the League, but which preferred to abandon it so that she might set out on the road of aggression and conquest, attacked the United States of America at Pearl Harbor. The Republic of Honduras, in spontaneous actions against the outrages of totalitarianism, hastened to declare war on the Japanese Empire and soon after on its companion in crime, Hitler's Germany. The government of Honduras was the first government in America to expel subversive agents of the Reich from its jurisdictions even before the outbreak of war. Honduras is a country of a small area and perforce limited economy. However, Honduras has the moral integrity of nations which love law and peace. My country took its stance as a belligerent against the Axis powers long before the glow of victory was visible on the horizon. We were sure that the imponderable values of the spirit, even though they might suffer a temporary eclipse, would endure and cherish in the heart of all free men. My country, Honduras, thus united its destiny with that of the nations facing the totalitarian aggressors who, in their wild schemes, believed themselves to be master of the entire world. So it was that Honduras signed the joint declaration of the United Nations, freely offering her resources and her manpower in defense of freedom. Honduras has not failed in the role allotted her by history, and in recognition of her support in the war against the Axis powers, had come to the Conference on International Organization. Honduras does not have the mighty strength of the victorious great powers, but she does have the undeniable attribute of sovereign equality enjoyed equally by all peace-loving nations. The government of Honduras, in its full support of the principle of freedom, did not hesitate to accept the invitation extended by the United States of America, by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and by the Republic of China to be represented in this historical conference, where the fundamental principles of law and justice and the broad doctrines of universal welfare must find expression in international policy. Out of the blood, destruction, and death wrought by the totalitarian aggression against free peoples, man's inherited dignity must lift him beyond the horrors of hatred. In this cosmopolitan and hospitable city of San Francisco are assembled together representatives of peoples and governments from all parts of the earth. All are guided by the light of the same ideals. They have gathered to create out of the enduring qualities of freedom, justice, and love the world of tomorrow, which must be based on the peace and security of nations. Honduras paid tribute to the historic achievement of the United States of America, of Russia, of England, and of China in establishing the Dumbarton Oak plans as a basis for the study of the problem of peace and international security. The political, economic, and social aims which form part of the plan of the international organization constitute a great advance toward stable peace and prevention of war. Yet, there remains the urgent necessity of creating a functional organism which will assure that peace. Whether it be the United States of America, Russia, England, China, or France, whatever the powers which assume the responsibility for guaranteeing the peace, whatever the political realities so-called, we may well remember that in the last analysis, human values must be the basis for united and enduring action against the depreciation of brute force. Above all, let us remember that 46 sovereign states, which here will deliberate upon the stability of peace and the suppression of war, will make law in the invariable guide of their decision, with justice their driving force toward the realization of the common good. Precisely by reason of their sovereignty, the participating nations will, in their common cause and unity of effort, exalt their individual status by molding it to serve the good of all. Whether nations be great or small, able to defend unaided, or whether they be protected by only an inner moral strength, each is necessary to the other in the war of civilization and culture, in the fight of progress, which in the first place is the realization of justice. And justice is what we have come here to look for. In this particular conception, all the United Nations are entitled to participate in any branch of the international organization, no matter how poor or how rich they might be, no matter if they are weak or powerful, with or without human or economic resources. The armed forces of the United Nations, the armed forces which yesterday jointly embraced close to the hideous redoubt of Berlin, are not only fighting for their own defense or interest, they are indeed fighting for the dignity and welfare of mankind. The main peoples and governments which have congregated here to deliberate and resolve in war, peace, and security, despite their divergency of geography, history, power, or political systems, have only one moral purpose, that of working together for the good of the international community. The Republic of Honduras is small in size. It has, nevertheless, sufficient moral space to make room for its responsibility. That responsibility which will bind her with regard to the obligation and rights derived from its participation in this conference because of its spontaneous contribution in the war effort. When Honduras threw its lots on the side of the United States of America, did not do it to become a theoretical belligerent. Honduras salutes the United Nations and expresses its hope and faith in the ideas of this survival world and in a better world to come.
And so concludes the third speech of the third plenary session here at the scene of the United Nations Conference in San Francisco.
The Chair now recognizes His Excellency, the Chairman of the Delegation of India.
The Chair has just recognized the Chairman of the delegation from India, His Excellency Sir A. Ramaswamy Madalier, supply member of the Governor General's Executive Council. He now approaches Mr. T.V. Soong. Again, they shake hands.
Mr. President, fellow delegates, sisters and brothers of the United Nations, I stand here to represent the views of a people who have throughout their storied past been known as a peace-loving people. In all the long history of India, whatever internal commotions may have taken place, the historian does not record a single instance of the people of India being aggressive or wanting to dominate over any people beyond their borders. On the other hand, India has been the refuge of all the persecuted of the lands from the days when the white Jews left their territory and came to the western coast of India, down to recent times when only the other day the refugees of that first invaded country, Poland, found sanctuary in my country. I remember with pleasure an incident only about 3 years back in the last months of 1942, when I and a colleague of mine were in England. The incident when General Sikorsky, on behalf of his people, came and thanked us for what we had done to the Polish refugees in our country. And sir, this habit of peace-loving is not due to any fact that we are not able to stand up against the invader, or that we have not played our part worthily in the military conflicts that have waged from time to time for the preservation of human liberties and the extension of human liberties. I need hardly refer to the part that India played in the last Great War, when our military strength was utilized towards defeating the same aggressor 25 years ago. In the plains of Flanders, in the nooks and corners of Gallipoli, in the arid deserts of Mesopotamia, Indian blood has been shed for what it considered the liberty of the world. And it is a tragedy of the first magnitude, a tragedy to which the mayor of this great city referred in his remarks the other day, that all that sacrifice has been in vain. 25 years later, when the call came that aggression should be put down, that the monster which had raised its head in Europe was likely, if unchecked, to dominate all the free-loving people of the world, the Indian people were ready to take their place among those who would fight for the preservation of liberty of the human people. Nay, more, Mr. President, if I could voice forth the feelings of my people, it was not in 1939 alone, but throughout that period that you referred to, when this war first began in 1931, when democratic countries were still hesitating about the attitude that they should take, when in fine balances at Geneva and elsewhere, the people of other countries were wondering whether they should take their part in putting down the aggression that then began, the Indian people, at any rate, had no hesitation in showing where their feelings and where their sympathy lay with your great country, China. And they waited and watched, and they watched and waited, till at long last the opportunity came when even the tired countries of the West could no longer suffer the onward march of the dictators. And they decided to take their firm and their last stand against Germany, the great aggressor in Europe. Sir, I have said that ours is not merely a peace-loving country in the sense that it could merely pray for peace and keep quiet with folded hands. In this war, in the north of Africa, at Dunkirk, in Italy, and in Greece, in the Middle East countries, the armies of India have played their worthy part. And it has made a matter of supreme satisfaction to us that our armies played the main part, if I might say so, at the Battle of Keren, and in liberating a country which was swallowed up by an aggressor country only recently. Unaided, unsupported, almost uncared for, the great and ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. I know that my people were pleased, more than pleased, grateful, more than grateful, that it had been given to them to free this ancient country, to their armies, to be instrumental in the main in freeing this great and ancient country and releasing it from the thraldom of an aggressive power. Mr. President, we are met here at the invitation of the four great powers. They have done their utmost. They are doing their utmost to contribute to the success of this war. In fact, one may say they have almost won the war. Certainly in the West, and the decision is no longer in the balance. The decision is no longer in doubt as to their winning the war in the East also. We talk of great powers and of small powers. We talk of the special responsibility of great powers, the special privilege of great powers also. I should like to put in its proper perspective what India has done in this war. 2,500,000 of the sons of India, soldiers drawn from every part of the country, drawn on a voluntary basis, are today fighting in the different parts of the world against the common aggressor force. May I point out, Mr. President, that next after the great countries, the four inviting powers, next in strength to the armies of these four great inviting powers is the strength of the army of India, which is fighting the aggressor nations today. I speak not in boastfulness, but in utter modesty. But I should like to remind myself and others at this conference of one fact. I should like to be like the Laputan flapper, speaking with bated breath and with whispering humbleness, to draw the attention of the great powers that by themselves, none of them individually could have stood against the great tyrant and aggressor. That in unity with others, they have been able to achieve the success that they have done. And that, moreover, smaller countries, by their contribution also, have helped to achieve the present result. I am one of... We talk of independence. We talk of sovereign rights. I am one of those that believe in sovereign rights. But I believe the world has come to a stage when the emphasis ought not to be so much on independence as on interdependence. None of us, not even the great powers, as I said, individually, could foresee all the combinations or all the developments of even any single power and be assured that by itself, its own remorseless strength, its own vital powers, it could always be secure and maintain its sovereign status. At this Dumbarton Oaks conference, while I recognize, and all of us who are called the smaller nations recognize, the essential features and basis of this conference, while we realize that the main responsibility is on the great powers, I should like humbly to suggest to the great powers themselves that they also serve who only stand and wait. That the smaller nations who have contributed a little one way or the other may also at times of stress be not altogether a negligible factor in maintaining security. Mr. President, there is one other aspect of the question that I should like to refer to. I was following the speeches of the four sponsoring governments, the speeches of the representatives of the four sponsoring governments. And I found that an aspect to which my country attaches the very greatest importance was touched upon by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom when he spoke of the constitution of the social and economic councils under the Dumbarton Oaks Conference proposals. It seems to me that sufficient attention has so far been not adverted to this aspect of the question. That while we are all thinking of security, of armed forces which will prevent aggression, we are likely to forget the basic factor in all these considerations, the cause which leads to aggression. It is economic injustice and even more social injustice that has bred for all time in the past the great causes of war and have led to these great Armageddons. And therefore, while at this hour, when nations are going through the rack of conquest and therefore have much more emphasis laid on security and armed strength which prevents aggression, let us not forget for a moment the vast emphasis that has to be laid on the causes that lead to war, economic and social injustice. And beyond that, and more than that, there is one other factor which has to be realized. We are all asked to be realists. We are asked to recognize various factors in the world set up as it exists today. There is one great reality, one fundamental factor, one eternal verity which all religions teach, which must be remembered by all of us. The dignity of the common man, the fundamental human rights of all beings all over the world. Those rights are incapable of segregation or of isolation. There is neither border nor breed, nor color or creed on which those rights can be separated as between beings and beings. And speaking as an Asiatic, may I say that that is an aspect of the question which can never be forgotten. And if we are laying the foundations for peace, we can only lay them truly and justly, to last for some time, for a couple of generations at least, if those fundamental human rights of all beings all over the world are recognized and man and woman are treated as equal in every sphere so far as opportunities are concerned. Mr. President, I do not want to detain this assembly very long. More speeches and speeches of much greater value are going to be delivered, and I should like to listen to them. I do not therefore propose to go into the question of what amendments my delegation are likely to submit. I have given a free indication in the general observations that I have made of the kind of amendments that India is likely to suggest for the consideration of this conference. There is one aspect of the question, again, with which we fully agree. The Secretary of State of this great country stated in his speech that we must lay the foundations and prepare the plan, but that it would be a mistake to expect that the full details will be worked out here, and that it is not right, not advisable, not safe to put too many details in any plan that this conference may devise. I entirely agree with that. I myself believe that if we can lay the foundations firmly on the basis of justice and of equality and of fundamental human rights, having an eye to the causes that create war, having an eye to the measures and the mechanism by which war can be prevented. We should have done the right thing at this great conference, and we should have done the right thing by those people who have sacrificed and by those people who are today sacrificing their all in the cause of liberty. Mr. President, among all the features that attracted my attention at the opening of this conference the other day was the line of young men and women who stood behind the President at the time, the young men and women whose future we are planning, the young men and women who will have to play their part, who have played their part at present, and who are asking what the aged people who happen to be statesmen and administrators of various countries are thinking about the future. They are not going to come back into their old ruts of life, contented to pass smoothly under the dictation of what may be called elderly advice, without questioning from the very beginnings the wisdom of all the actions that we are likely to take at this conference. And they will have a right to do so. The future world is theirs. The peace plan that we are planning is for them, not for us. And in the days to come, it is to them that we shall be responsible if we do not achieve our purpose here and do not plan wisely. I said that we agreed entirely that it was not advisable to load too much work on this assembly, but that the main outlines, the fundamentals, should be agreed to in keeping with the ideas that I have been developing during the last few minutes. And I agree, if I might venture to quote a few lines, I agree with the spirit of the great cardinal who said, "Lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. One step is enough for me. I do not seek to see the distant path. Lead thou me on." Thank you.
Now receiving the applause from his fellow delegates, His Excellency Sir A. Ramaswamy Madalier, Supply Member of the Governor General's Executive Council and Chairman of the delegation from India. Again, back to the Speaker's rostrum after this applause, and the Chairman, Mr. Sung.
I next recognize His Excellency, the Chairman of the Delegation of Iran.
The Chairman of the delegation from Iran is now approaching the Speaker's rostrum. His Excellency Mustafa Adil, Minister of Justice and Chairman of his delegation.
Monsieur le Président, Messieurs, Mesdames et Messieurs, la très noble intention qui a présidé à l'organisation de cette conférence a été grandement appréciée par mon pays et je suis heureux de l'occasion qui m'est offerte et j'en remercie Monsieur le Président pour exprimer l'admiration et la gratitude de l'Iran à l'égard des grands hommes qui ont pris cette initiative. Comment donc ne pas évoquer tout de suite le souvenir du président Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Tous les pays épris de paix, de justice et d'équité rendent hommage à sa mémoire. L'Iran a une raison de plus pour accomplir cette mission, puisqu'il a eu le privilège de le recevoir, ne fût-ce que pour quelques jours, dans sa capitale lors de la conférence de Téhéran, et ce, lorsque le président Roosevelt déployait toute son activité en collaboration avec le maréchal Staline et M. Churchill, pour élaborer les plans de la victoire qui, depuis cette époque, n'a pas cessé de confondre et de traquer l'ennemi commun. Il ne sera jamais superflu de répéter que la guerre actuelle, imposée par les agresseurs aux Nations Unies, a pour but final d'établir le règne de la justice et d'assurer une paix durable, afin que les malheurs dont souffre à l'heure actuelle l'humanité ne se répètent plus à l'avenir. Cette guerre n'a épargné aucun pays. Le mien a ressenti à son tour ce qu'elle peut apporter de malheur et de souffrance. Il a cependant la consolation de constater que ses grands alliés ont reconnu solennellement dans la déclaration de Téhéran l'aide apportée par lui à la cause commune. Les vénérables délégués qui m'ont précédé ici ont expliqué avec éloquence combien il est nécessaire de jeter les bases solides d'une paix durable et d'établir entre les pays une entente politique et une solidarité économique basée sur les principes d'égalité et de justice. Nous sommes heureux de constater que le projet de Dumbarton Oaks a déjà posé les bases de cette paix à laquelle la démocratie du monde est si fermement attachée. Nous estimons cependant qu'il faut préciser davantage certains points afin que l'intégrité territoriale et l'indépendance politique et économique des États membres de la future société soient pleinement assurées. La délégation iranienne ne manquera pas de présenter en temps opportun ses propositions. Je me permets d'insister également sur l'importance d'une collaboration intellectuelle et morale. Pour que les individus vivent en paix, il importe qu'ils s'entendent, qu'ils se comprennent. Il en est de même des nations. L'inobservance de ce principe est, à mon avis, l'une des causes profondes des malentendus qui troublent la paix. Dans la nouvelle organisation, la coopération intellectuelle devra donc occuper une place de choix. Je crois être non seulement l'interprète des sentiments de mon pays, mais aussi celui des sentiments des pays ici représentés, en exprimant le ferme espoir que nous ne faillirons pas à notre devoir et que nous irons droit au but. J'entends par là que cette conférence ne se clôturera pas avant d'avoir posé le fondement d'un organisme international qui doit sauvegarder et assurer la paix et la sécurité du monde. Nous avons tous parcouru des milliers de kilomètres. Nous sommes venus des coins les plus éloignés du globe, escortés par les vœux des millions d'âmes de différentes races et de différentes religions, éprises de paix, de justice et de liberté. Elles ont placé leur foi en nous. Nous ne devons pas retourner les mains vides. Nos peuples s'attendent à ce que leurs délégués rapportent la charte signée à San Francisco qui assurera le bien-être de l'humanité. Faisons notre possible pour ne pas les décevoir.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude that very short speech by the chairman of the delegation from Iran. Again,
I now recognize His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Delegation of the Netherlands.
the chairman of the delegation from the Netherlands has been recognized from the rostrum. Mr. Van Cliffens, Minister for Foreign Affairs and, of course, Chairman for his delegation. Now approaching the Speaker's rostrum, shakes hands with Mr. Soong, receiving a brief applause from his fellow delegates, places his prepared script on the stand, and in just a moment, His Excellency, Mr. Van Cliffens.
Mr. Chairman and fellow delegates, on behalf of the Netherlands delegation, I should like to contribute only a few brief remarks to this general debate. First of all, I wish to confirm that the government we have the honor to represent is wholeheartedly in favor of a plan generally acceptable to the United Nations for the maintenance of international security. And in endeavoring to help reaching that goal, we simply continue a tradition. The Netherlands have always stood for a better organized international community. We should like to see international anarchy reduced to the utmost possible extent. We are ready to accept certain limitations of that more or less complete freedom of action which hitherto has characterized a sovereign state. We should like to see those limitations accepted in the same measure by all states, great and small. But if this cannot be obtained at once, and if together with the other medium and smaller states we are to set an example in this respect, we shall be proud to do it. We fully recognize that apart from the sovereign equality of peace-loving states, which is a legal concept, there are between them inequalities in the realm of facts which must be duly taken into account. But let me point out that in the realm of facts there is in another sense complete equality between larger and smaller states, inasmuch as good and just ideas may and do occur to either category without regard to size or power. And I need not remind anyone that the intrinsic force of good and just ideas is very great. We of the Netherlands have learned through bitter experience how necessary it is that every possible effort be made to make war as unlikely a contingency as is possible. We have fought and suffered in the course of the present conflict, and we are still suffering as few others. Almost everything has been taken away from us by our enemies except our honor and our abiding faith. But the price we are paying is enormous, not only in wealth, but also and most especially in terms of human life and happiness. Even our very soil has been partly destroyed. We should therefore like to see conditions created which will make it impossible, or at any rate unlikely, that ever again an innocent country should be thrown into such a depth of what we, applying human standards, consider undeserved sorrow. The world must be enabled to restore civilization to its proper place, seeking that harmony between the rights of the individual and those of the community, national or international, which is the essential goal in our pursuit of happiness. We recognize that to attain that end, a good plan is an essential element. But even the best plan could be of no avail without an earnest resolve to observe in international relations those simple moral standards which our enemies have debased to their everlasting infamy. I do not think that we can add anything to the exposition we have heard from those who spoke before me of the noble ideals we should strive to attain. Let us rather insist on the need to carry our good intentions into practical effect. We have endeavored to make our point of view clear before the conference opened. We have also laid on the table of the conference certain amendments which we hope and trust will prove to find favor with all, and whose adoption, together with suggestions presented by others, would make the result of the conversations of Dumbarton Oaks more acceptable to all the United Nations. We approach this great work with an open mind, and we are ready to take the views of others into the most serious and sympathetic consideration. Let us then approach this business in a practical fashion. We should like the working committees to start their labors as soon as possible. Moved by a spirit of sober optimism and that humility which is fitting in view of the magnitude of our task, we hope to contribute all we can to the success of the conference, for we cannot and should not forget that it has been said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Blessed are the peacemakers, and so the memory is blessed of that great American, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom to our deep sorrow we have lost. It was one of the ironies of fate that this friend and champion of peace had to engage in war in order to obtain it. We of the Netherlands are proud to think that through his ancestry he belonged to our nation. To us, in our tribulations, he has been a staunch friend, a wise counselor, a veritable pillar of strength. His departure leaves this world a poorer place. Let his memory inspire us.
Just concluding his remarks, His Excellency Jelko N. van Clettens, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the delegation from the Netherlands. Incidentally, the first.
His Excellency, the Chairman of the delegation of Lebanon, has designated the Minister Plenipotentiary of Lebanon to the United States as Speaker for the delegation of Lebanon. The Chair recognizes His Excellency, the Delegate of Lebanon, who will be the last speaker of this session.
The last speaker, Mr. Sung, the chairman here this morning, has just announced the delegate from Lebanon, His Excellency Wadi Naim, Minister of the Interior, who quickly approaches the rostrum, places his script too on the speaker's stand, and
Mr. Chairman,
turn and speaks.
Fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Lebanon wishes to express its gratitude to the great powers inviting to the United Nations Conference on International Organization for their just invitation of Lebanon to the conference. Lebanon, as one of the United Nations, appreciates fully and shares the high motives which prompted them to hold this conference. There is presented today to the peace-loving nations of the world a unique historic opportunity for organizing the peace which, considering the infinite issues at stake, certainly no one can afford to miss or slight. Lebanon is completely ready to do its modest part in the maintenance of international peace and security on the basis of the Dumbarton Oaks proposals, which we believe are inspired by the principles of justice and the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states, big or small. It is impossible, Mr. Chairman, to be present here in this gathering without thinking of President Roosevelt. This conference would have been impossible without his continued devotion to the cause of justice and his vision for a true unity among the nations. We in Lebanon have deeply grieved his loss. We have come to know that when freedom and justice were in question, he was sure to be their champion. No greater and more fitting homage can be done President Roosevelt than for all of us, great or small, to bend every effort to produce a world charter embodying the supreme principles he so dearly loved. As regards the fundamental purposes of the proposed organization of the United Nations, Lebanon wishes to suggest that there be added the following purpose: to create a permanent committee of jurists whose function shall be the periodic codification or consolidation of existing principles of international law, together with the modifications thereof, which shall be deemed necessary from time to time. It is obvious that the precise formulation of the law of nations, brought always up to date in accordance with the development of the theory and practice of that law, will be a potent instrument for the maintenance of international peace and security. In this way, the more political and military aspects of the organization, on which the Dumbarton Oaks proposals seem to lay such justifiable stress, will be balanced and tempered by those equally important requirements of international justice. The maintenance of international peace and security is certainly a worthy purpose of the United Nations. No price is too high for that end. But it will be noticed that in themselves, peace and security are merely formal, privative, and static. It is patent that certain outwardly peaceful and secure situations do not spring from genuine justice, and therefore are not worth maintaining. Unless then the positive content of peace is determined on a foundation of real justice, there will be no real peace. Accordingly, the United Nations in this conference must devote some time to the determination of a dynamic and positive conception of civilized existence, which will justify the organization they mean to set up. The peace which man believes in and will spontaneously rise up to defend is only that which is grounded in his ultimate rights and freedoms and in the reality of justice. There is a peace which only cloaks terrible inner conflicts, and there is a security which is utterly insecure. The proposals of Dumbarton Oaks envisage political, military, judicial, economic, and social measures for the maintenance of international peace and security. There is, however, hardly any mention of matters of an intellectual, moral, and educational order, except for the rather vague phrase humanitarian problems in Chapter 1, Article 3, and Chapter 9, Sections A and C, which may imply such matters. But the promotion of understanding in respect of ideas and beliefs among the nations is no small matter in the securing of enduring peace. Therefore, educational and intellectual cooperation among the nations is of the utmost importance. A free exchange of ideas will train the mind in the ways of peace and will bring the nations together. The United Nations can save themselves many wars if they attend properly to the liberal arts of peace. To this end, certain small nations, while they may not be in themselves of much consequence militarily and politically, may be of the greatest importance intellectually and educationally. Their unobtrusive moral contribution to international peace and security is altogether out of proportion to their size or material importance. Nations such as Lebanon, by reason of their traditions, educational institutions, potentialities, and geographical position, must be looked upon as peculiarly entitled to a dominant representation in the Economic and Social Council or in an educational commission under that council. The present war, Mr. Chairman, is drawing to a close. We here are interested in the organization of peace. But the important thing is not the war of arms, nor therefore the peace, which merely means the absence of such war. The important thing is the war of ideas. The war of arms itself derives whatever importance it has from whether it decides rightly in the war of ideas. There is no doubt in our mind that the decision which is being enacted today in the various theaters of war is a right decision. But when we look ahead to the years of peace, we find that distressingly little is being contemplated to be done in this conference in the realm of the mind and spirit. For the most part, we are dealing with means and instruments and machinery and mere framework and form. But certainly, the fundamental thing is the spirit which fills and justifies that form. It is to the spirit and mind of man, to his ideas and his attitudes, that we must devote considerable attention if the peace is going to be truly won. Unless we secure the right conditions for spiritual and intellectual health, and unless we determine the right positive ideals for which man should live, I am afraid all our work in this conference may prove to have been in vain.
Ladies and gentlemen, this session is now adjourned. The next session will be held in this same auditorium at 3:30 this afternoon.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude the third plenary session from the Opera House, the scene of the United Nations Conference for International Organization in San Francisco, concluding with the rap of the gavel from the presiding chairman this morning, His Excellency Mr. T.V. Soong. The last speaker was Mr. Wadi Naim, the Minister of the Interior, also chairman of the delegation from Lebanon. The hall is now rapidly clearing, particularly inasmuch as only half of the delegates seem to be present this morning. All of the big powers were here. Down on the floor now, I see State Secretary Edward Stettinius gesticulating to Lord Halifax of Great Britain. Lord Halifax has turned his head so as to hear. Mr. Stettinius now reaches into his pocket continues to talk, and now Mr. Halifax himself is speaking to Mr. Stettinius. The photographers have gathered around both of them. Mr. Stettinius' military aide is standing to his right. Of course, we can't hear what they're saying. We would like to have a microphone down there, I know. We might mention here, too, that the very distinguished but long-legged Lord Halifax was climbing over the rows of seats here in the chambers this morning just before we went on the air, and doing it without effort nor loss of dignity. They're both now lighting cigarettes. Mr. Stettinius was sitting this morning with the American delegation and was, of course, not on the rostrum. As we said a moment ago, only half of the delegates were present. Mr. Molotov was listening intently throughout the proceedings here through the ears of his interpreter, Mr. Pavlov, who ad-libs the translation and then cues Mr. Molotov when to applaud, and that he did from time to time vigorously. Also here this morning, but coming in late, was Senator Tom Connally of Texas, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that winds up the activities here this morning. The hall has rapidly cleared. The Klieg lights have been turned out. We have been speaking to you from the NBC box at the scene of the third plenary session of the United Nations Conference for International Organization at the Opera House in San Francisco. Steve Robertson speaking. This is the National Broadcasting Company.